Give my regards to Broadway, remember me to Herald Square.
With his glory days playing hockey and football at Princeton behind him, Hobey Baker moved to New York City in the fall of 1914. No longer a college sports hero, he was now a low-level functionary buried deep in the basement of the J.P. Morgan Bank. Baker was now a member of what would be called the Lost Generation, a generation that was born into the thrilling possibilities of the new industrial age, but soon found themselves facing the horrors of a global modern war, World War I. Hobey's Princeton classmate F. Scott Fitzgerald described their generation in his novel, This Side of Paradise.
Here was a new generation, shouting the old cries, learning the old creeds, through a reverie of long days and nights, destined finally to go out into that dirty gray turmoil, to follow love and pride. A new generation, dedicated more than the last to the fear of poverty and the worship of success.
For Baker, his generation's relentless pursuit of money felt empty. It was no replacement for the adrenaline rush of the cheering crowds at Princeton as he returned punts for touchdowns or effortlessly skated down the ice, scoring hockey goals seemingly at will. Hobey complained to friends that his bank job left him feeling like a caged and neutered tiger.
I realize that my life is finished. No matter how long I live, I will never equal the excitement of playing on the football fields.
In a letter to Baker biographer John Davies, a Princeton classmate recalled Hobey telling him how despondent he was with his post-college life.
And just think of all the things I could do today if I didn't have to work.
I'm David Duchovny. From 30 for 30 podcasts, this is Searching for Hobey Baker, Episode 2, The Lost Generation. Recognizing Hobey's despair, Percy Pyne, a multimillionaire and Princeton alum, threw Baker a lifeline, inviting him to come live in his sumptuous Midtown Manhattan mansion on Madison Avenue, an offer that Hobey eagerly accepted.
So he says, hey, I'll live in New York. And again, he has no real financial stability at this point.
Baker biographer Tim Rapley.
His dad's out of money, and Percy Pyne is there and says, come live with me at my mansion.
Pyne was a character out of America's Gilded Age, a time when rapid economic growth led to massive wealth concentrated in the hands of a select but very visible few. In describing this era, Mark Twain coined the term Gilded Age, as opposed to golden, maintaining that the excesses of the super-rich were a shiny veneer that hid the growing inequality and frustration experienced by the unseen millions in the underclass. However, this concentration of wealth did not trouble Percy Rivington Pyne II. A son of inherited mega-wealth, he moved easily in the refined circles of the masters of industry who owned the banks, railroads, oil companies, and steel mills. Their money allowed them the freedom to spend their days as sportsmen, sailors, adventurers, clubmen, and high society hosts. They were the celebrities and influencers of the day. Hobey had seen brief glimpses of this world during his 4 years at Princeton, with Baker the celebrity athlete who the wealthy sought to befriend. But now, living with Percy, who was 9 years his senior, Hobey was thrust into its epicenter.
Percy was very, very generous to him. Very generous.
Emile Salvini is the author of Hobey Baker, American Legend.
And he just had this on-again, off-again hero worship of Hobey. He couldn't spend enough time with Hobey.
Hobey and Percy would dine and party together at the over 35 private clubs where Percy was a member. Clubs like Long Island's Southside Sportsman Club, whose membership included many of New York's gilded elite. Southside even had its own stop on the Long Island Railroad. On summer weekends, Percy and Hobey could be found hunting game or shooting trap at Southside, or lounging poolside at Rivington House, Pyne's palatial mansion on Long Island's North Shore. Tim Rapley.
Hobey is living like some scene out of The Great Gatsby, where he's feeling insecure like the protagonist of The Great Gatsby, but kind of on the arm of Percy Pyne. These are manly pursuits: auto racing, polo, golf, cigars with other men, in the clubs. It was a club life he led thanks to Percy.
Percy showered Hobey with special gifts: an elaborate leather toilet kit, a silver-plated cigarette box engraved with Percy's and Hobey's initials, an item that you can still find today in the Hobey Baker archives at Princeton University. A close friend of both Hobey and Percy was Charlie Biddle, an attorney, wealthy member of the Philadelphia Main Line, and a fellow Princeton alum. In a letter, Percy jokingly castigated Biddle for missing one of his extravagant weekends at Drumthwacket, his family's mansion in Princeton.
Dear Charlie, what under the sun was the matter with you over Sunday that you did not come to Princeton? We had a ripping weekend. We ought to arrange a date in Princeton when we could all get down sometime before commencement, and we could have a small dinner or something of that sort. Write to me soon and let me know what you're doing. As ever, your sincere friend, Percy.
Percy was the consummate host, one who loved giving lavish parties. When he died in 1950, the New York Times spent much of his obituary describing a gala party, one that Hobey and many other high society luminaries attended. Here's an excerpt from the Times obit.
Pyne gave a large dinner at Sherry's on Fifth Avenue on February 5th, 1917, before the Cornelius Vanderbilt dance at the Vanderbilt home. The Sherry Ballroom was transformed into a section of a Paris boulevard with a line of cafes and restaurants.
An article in the New York Sun added additional detail.
As the dinner was being served, there was a continuous vaudeville which suggested the street life of Paris. And under the street lamps there wandered typical gendarmes, street gamines, donkey carts, performing clowns and acrobats, organ grinders and Hawaiian musicians.
When people say Percy Pyne was the Liberace of his time, they cite examples like this of how flamboyant and outrageous he was. So it was not soon forgotten.
As Hobey's relationship with his housemate, Percy, became increasingly close, his college friends expressed their discomfort.
Percy was inclined to have a succession of fair-haired younger men, protégés, if you will, and Hobey became one.
Wendell Kuhn, a Princeton hockey teammate, shared his discomfort years later in a letter to Hobey biographer John Davies.
I think it's too bad Hobey went to live with Percy, inconsistent with his money status, and likely to spoil him for the creature comforts Percy could give him. I can't imagine Hobey being happy in such a situation, dependent, obligated.
From the 1920s, America saw growing repression of gay and bisexual men, reaching its peak in the early days of the AIDS crisis in the 1980s. But the pre-World War I New York that Hobey and Percy lived in was a place and a time where space existed for gay couples. Men who had relationships with men had to be cautious and contained, avoid ostentatious demonstrations of love, and also navigate religious and cultural norms. But as Columbia University professor of history George Chauncey writes in his groundbreaking book, Gay New York, the very severity of the post-war reaction to homosexuality has tended to blind us to the relative tolerance of the pre-war years.
In the later 19th and early 20th centuries, the categories that we know today as homosexuality, heterosexuality, bisexuality were simply far less defined than the ones that we know today. The acts were understood as acts of sex, but not defining of a person.
Professor Nicholas Surrett is an associate dean at the University of Kansas and an editor of the Journal of the History of Sexuality.
It was in the later 19th and early 20th centuries when many societies, and particularly in the U.S., came to understand the categories of the homosexual and heterosexual as being different from one another. But the process was not complete, really, even by the 1920s. So what that meant is that some people of the same sex could have sex with one another without thinking that it meant anything in particular about their sexual identity. They didn't have to identify as being different from the rest of quote-unquote normal people at that moment.
David Doyle is a professor of history at Southern Methodist University and an expert on same-sex relationships during this period.
When we think about, let's say, same-sex attractions before the late 19th century, or I would say maybe even before the 20th century, there's much more freedom. What we can see is that these relationships are very powerful and very intense. Sometimes they coexisted with heterosexual relationships, often they didn't. So if we talk about the closet, I would say that's completely a 20th century construct.
Percy Pyne was the archetypal gay bachelor, hiding in plain sight. Few had doubts about his sexual preference. Columbia University's Chauncey describes the classic upper-class gay man of that era as highly mannered with ambiguous sophistication. He would have pronounced Anglophilia with a reverence of the elegance and wit of the English gentry. In short, this describes Percy Rivington Pyne II to a T. And what of Hobey? Contemporary accounts of Baker portray him as a masculine man with a clear affinity for other men. Wendell Kuhn, Baker's roommate at St. Paul's and Princeton, wrote to Hobey's biographer, John Davies.
I don't think dating women interested him much in school or in college.
After one of their college hockey games, Kuhn and Hobey found a note in the locker room addressed to them from two female admirers. Hobey biographer Tim Rapley recounts the story,
saying, hey, you and Hobey, meet us after the game. We'll be there in a car. We're going to take you on a hot date. And Hobey was terrified. And Hobey snuck out through the boiler room so he wouldn't have to face these women.
Another friend, Alvin Devereux, roomed with Baker on his post-college voyage to Europe in 1914. He wrote to biographer John Davies with this memory.
With his lean but well-muscled figure and his handsome, manly yet boyish face, he was someone who would appeal to both men and women alike. Strange to say, I can't recall that there were any girls on the steamer with whom he got acquainted.
Hobey's new life in New York included more than his living and partying with Percy. At a time when former college athletes had few options to play professionally, many joined amateur teams. In fact, a few months after moving to New York, Hobey was back in a world where he felt at home, the ice rink, playing for the St. Nicholas Hockey Club. New York's professional NHL hockey team, the New York Rangers, wouldn't be established for another decade, so amateur teams like St. Nick's were the only game in town. St. Nick's and the teams they played against featured former players from Princeton, Yale, and Harvard. Their home ice was St. Nicholas Arena, the same Upper West Side Manhattan rink where Hobey had played his Princeton home games. On game days, Hobey would arrive at St. Nick's in his own chauffeured car, courtesy of Percy.
People at the time said that it looked like an opera house.
Baker biographer Emile Silvini.
The limousines and fine carriages would line up around the hockey rink, especially if they knew Hobey was playing. He was a darling of the sports world. They played in New York, Philly, and Boston. Women wore, their mink stoles, and men actually had evening wear. It must have been quite a sight.
After one of St. Nick's home games, the New York Post's Lawrence Perry wrote glowingly about the Baker phenomenon at St. Nick's.
Men and women went hysterical when Baker flashed down the ice on one of his brilliant runs with the puck. I have never heard such spontaneous cheering for an athlete as greeted him 100 times a night and never expect to again.
Inside St. Nick's, heaving crowds would lean over the balconies for a closer view of Hobey's athletic artistry. As they did during his college days, fans would often shout, "Here he comes," as Hobey rounded his own goal to pick up speed and then streaked down the ice. weaving effortlessly through a stunned and hapless opposition. Hobey seemingly scored at will. Ever present at St. Nick's games was Percy Pyne, keeping a bottle of rock and rye furtively stashed in his raccoon coat. But Hobey's most famous hockey game for St. Nick's took place not on his home ice, but up in the far north, in December 1915 in Canada, hockey's proverbial mecca.
Hobey and St. Nick's come up to Montreal and play in the predecessor to the Montreal Forum, a 10,000-seat super hockey arena, and it's the biggest hockey city in the world.
Hobey biographer Tim Rapley.
This is Montreal at its absolute best. The best players in the world come up there. And Hobey Baker had a reputation that preceded him. His teams had beaten the best amateur teams all through Canada. But the Montreal Stars were the defending Ross Cup champions, and no one gave these Americans a chance. And Hobey goes out and puts on this spectacular show where he had 2 goals, 3 assists. Hobey dominates all day, all long. Hobey blew their minds in the biggest venue of them all.
Hobey's domination in front of the largest crowd ever to watch a hockey game made front-page news in the Montreal press.
Uncle Sam has had the cheek to develop a first-class hockey player. We had heard him advertised as a great hockey player, and we had always smiled a cynical grin at the thought. A few minutes of Baker on the ice convinced the most skeptical. He could catch a place and a star's place on any of our professional teams. We didn't want the St. Nick's to win, but Baker cooked our goose so artistically that we enjoyed it.
In the end, St. Nick's won 6-2, with Hobey playing a part in 5 of the team's 6 goals.
If one game can get you into the Hockey Hall of Fame, this was it.
Impressed that this Baker fellow, this Yank, was as good a hockey player as advertised, the Montreal Canadiens offered Hobey a contract to play professionally in the National Hockey Association, the predecessor to the NHL.
I've read in multiple published reports that he was offered $20,000, which was more than almost anybody else was paid, to become a professional hockey player, which is, people in Canada would say, why the heck didn't he take that? And Hobey didn't even consider playing professional hockey. It totally violated the code. We are amateur athletes, and it's the amateur code, and there's no way I'm going to play hockey for pay.
Biographer John Davies described Hobey as a heady wine, a combination of Tom Brown and Sir Galahad, the superb athlete, mannered, modest, handsome, who was actually a gentleman and an amateur and a sportsman. There was certainly a class dimension to amateur athletics at the time, a time long before college athletes unionized or negotiated NILs. Hobey venerated the amateur athlete while holding disdain for professional athletes, calling them muckers. For Hobey, amateurism represented sport in its purest form, untainted by money or commercialism. We do not know whether he understood that amateurism also denied him the opportunity to play against the very best, regardless of their race or position in society. But in addition to his rigid adherence to amateurism, author Vernon Andrews was struck by another Baker trait, one that ran counter to the modest amateur athlete: Hobey's love for showmanship, coupled with a touch of vanity.
Hobey played so people can see him, see his face, see his hair, and that's what professional football players do when they take off their helmets. They want people to see who they are. Hobey decided that he was a handsome man, that he was attractive, that he wanted to be seen. Leather helmet or not, it's dangerous. But he said, I'm going to forego that danger. I want to show myself. I want people to see me out here. I'm the star. Yes, Hobey was a showman. Hobey liked how he looked. Hobey liked the responses of other people to how he looked and how he played. There are 3 words that sound pretty close: showmanship, sportsmanship, showboating. All in the same little pot, all brewing together.
The whole atmosphere was electric when he was playing. Everybody would just stand up when he got the puck or caught the punt.
A contemporary of Baker's, John Tunis, a Harvard graduate and columnist for The New Yorker, wrote about Hobey's charismatic presence.
He never wore a headguard in football. And I remember that great shock of blonde hair. Hobey standing, waiting all alone. He was the only player on the field you looked at, the only player you saw. He did everything with a kind of showmanship that wasn't showmanship because it was natural to him. Never was anybody like Baker.
Those who watched Hobey play admired him as much for his raw physical beauty as for his prodigious athletic gifts. In their letters to Hobey's Princeton biographer John Davies, Hobey's classmates didn't hesitate to describe how he looked physically. Donald Watt.
I worshipped him from afar. Seeing him in action on the ice was more beautiful than watching the movements of any ballerina.
Grant Peacock.
A fine likeness of Hobey hangs in my apartment. I see it every day. He was an Adonis, a perfect specimen without blemish.
Henry Beyer.
I could still visualize that amazing Greek god physique, the finest I believe I have ever seen. It was difficult to take my eyes off that wonderful, beautiful body.
Hobey Baker would have found this praise from his classmates embarrassing. In fact, while he was the consummate showman on the ice or football field, once he was out of the limelight, he was a modest man, almost shy. After games, he would often beg newspaper reporters not to write about him or his athletic exploits, asking them instead to interview and feature his teammates' accomplishments. But increasingly, by 1916, the newspapers were reporting on matters greater than what Hobey Baker or his teammates were doing in Manhattan's rinks. Attention was turning to the war in Europe, now in its third horrific year with a death toll in the millions, with opposing sides gripped in the endless, bloody stalemate of trench warfare. Yet Hobey longed to get into the war, and had even tried to sign up in 1914 when he was in London, only to be stopped by a Princeton professor from enlisting. Now, hoping that America might soon get into the war, Hobey took up a new challenge, and what he considered a newfangled sport, flying, joining an Air National Guard unit in Manhattan.
America's looking at the war raging in Europe. There's this thought, okay, America's probably going to get into this.
Jeremy Kinney is a leading authority on the World War I air war. He's the Associate Director for Research at the Smithsonian's Air and Space Museum in Washington, D.C.
They are flying, they're demonstrating, especially around New York. So they're really building this idea of what American military aviation will look like. We need to create this body, this cadre of officers that pay on their own dime to learn to fly. And they take it upon themselves to not only learn to fly, but they create their own reserve military aviation units.
Among Hobey's fellow pilots were Theodore Roosevelt's youngest son, Quentin, and Seth Low II, the son of the mayor of New York. Like Hobey, many of these early American pilots graduated from Ivy League schools and were top athletes, like Al Weatherhead, a former Harvard quarterback, Buck Church, a former Yale end, and Spuddy Pichon, a former Dartmouth quarterback. But flying proved to be a dangerous game, much more deadly than football. Just a little over a decade from the Wright brothers' first flight at Kitty Hawk, the planes they flew were primitive, flimsy, and subject to dangerous engine failures.
Flying is dangerous, and it's because of the frail type of technology at the time. But in this idea of wood structures covered in fabric, they're held together by wires with engines that could cut out or not run all the time in the air. It's a very dangerous business.
In the late fall of 1916, Hobey triumphantly returned to his old haunt, Princeton, flying in formation to Princeton's new football stadium, Palmer Stadium, where his alma mater was playing Yale. He was accompanied by 11 other pilots and planes, part of the biggest flight formation in the U.S. up to that time.
The New York Air National Guard unit that Hobey Baker was part of They did a demonstration flight, and they decided to fly to the football game. So he's the first person to arrive at a football game by an airplane, but he also he's showing his school spirit and kind of showing that deep connection between the Ivy League and the airplane and what it means for sports.
Sports reporter Robert Edgren described the flyover for the New York Evening World.
Before the game began, 2 specks appeared above the northern horizon. They grew until it was seen that they were Army planes. One of the planes circles above the field and, spiraling down to a moderate height, sailed slowly overhead and turned again to the north. "It's Baker," yells a megaphone cheerleader. And so it was. Hobey had flown down to see his old team win, and to see the game as he had never seen it before.
In early 1917, a few months after that epic flight over Princeton's football stadium, Hobey picked up and left New York City for Philadelphia, his hometown, to live with his older brother Thornton and his wife, Marie. Exactly why Hobey moved back remains a bit of a mystery. We know he was bored by his mundane life as a lowly banker, and now, older and no longer the physical Adonis he once was, perhaps he thought that rekindling his younger days, when the Baker brothers played hockey together at St. Paul's, might spark the excitement that his New York life lacked. He may have also felt a sense of filial duty to Thornton, who gave up his chance for college so Hobey could go to Princeton. And now, Thornton was still struggling to save the family upholstery business. Soon enough, the Baker brothers reunited on Thornton's amateur Philadelphia hockey team. Then, as luck would have it, Thornton's team was challenged by the top amateur hockey team in Pittsburgh, which played their games at the Duquesne Gardens. Hobey biographer Tim Rapley supplies the play-by-play.
They get on a train and they go play in Pittsburgh. And this game, it's all Hobey, and he's not in great shape. He's been smoking cigarettes and eating licorice, and he's getting gassed out there, and they're losing 2-1, and they're almost getting run out of the building. And then Hobey finds an extra gear, ties the game, sends it into overtime, and finally, after 2 overtimes, nothing had been settled. They had to agree to sudden death, and Hobey goes behind his own net, ends his final game with an overtime winner and the longest rush imaginable. There's never been a longer one because no one plays hockey on a 300-foot sheet. Hobey won his last game on a rink-length rush that no one will ever replicate.
With his beloved brother Thornton at his side, the preeminent player in the game had experienced one last magical hockey moment. As Hobey was packing up his hockey gear in Pittsburgh, rumors of war were resounding across America. Chief among the war hawks urging America to declare war on Germany was former President Teddy Roosevelt. President Wilson, who won his 1916 re-election with the slogan, "He kept us out of war," was now struggling mightily to maintain America's neutrality. Then, on February 24, 1917, British intelligence intercepted a top-secret coded telegram from the German foreign minister, Arthur Zimmermann. The Associated Press broke the story.
The telegram from the German foreign minister invited the Mexicans to make war together and make peace together. In return, Germany offered generous financial support and help to the Mexicans in occupying the states of Texas, New Mexico, and Arizona, territories that Mexico lost in 1848.
With this revelation, President Wilson now had little choice but to declare war on Germany, which he did on April 2, 1917, in an address to Congress.
With a profound sense of the solemn and even tragical character of the step I am taking, and of the grave responsibilities which it involves, but in unhesitating obedience to what I deem my constitutional duty, I advise that the Congress declare that it formally accept the status of belligerent which has thus been thrust upon it, and that it exert all its power and employ all its resources to bring the government of the German Empire to terms and end the war.
July 23, 1917, New York City. Newly commissioned U.S. Army officer Lieutenant Hobey Baker was headed off to Europe and the Great War. He arrived at Pier 54 and boarded the troop ship SS Orduna. He had been chauffeured to the pier in Percy's limousine after spending his last few days with Pyne at his Madison Avenue mansion. From the pier, Percy waved goodbye as Hobey hung over the railing, shoulder to shoulder with his fellow soldiers and pilots, each man trying desperately to catch a final glimpse of loved ones. As the troop ship cleared the Verrazano Narrows and the New York City skyline slowly dipped below the horizon, Hobey penned the first of scores of letters he wrote to Percy during his 18 months on the front lines. Letters written from Hobey's heart. Letters that provide us with an emotional insight into the depth and true nature of their relationship.
Dear Percy, it suddenly came over me as you drove off what was really happening, and I have not gotten over it yet. God knows I have not deserved all the affection you have given me. I feel, and have always felt, that I have stolen it from some other person for whom God meant it. I hope not. In any case, I am truly thankful. Affectionately, Hobey.
Hobey sealed the letter and put it safely away. He would mail it in England upon his arrival. But as he tried to sleep that night, Hobey remained troubled by the realization that today might have been the last time he ever saw Percy Pyne, or America, again. Coming up on the third and final episode of Searching for Hobey Baker.
I commenced firing at close range. I saw the pilot look down and would recognize him if I saw him on a street. We were so close. He was a beautiful pilot in a beautiful machine.
There are about 600 pilots when they start in the summer of 1917, and they lose 235 killed in action.
Hobey had flown perhaps a quarter mile after leveling off. At the worst possible place and fraction of time, his motor cut out.
Searching for Hobey Baker was narrated by David Duchovny. The series was executive produced by Ross Greenberg, Andrew Reynolds, and Timothy Smith. From Silver Sound, the producer and re-recording mixer for the production was Corey Choi. The supervising sound designer was Luke Allen. Our original music and music supervision was done by John Sands and Wayne Sharp. The associate producer for this podcast was Evan Janikin. Also from Silver Sound, additional producing by Hunt Beatty and Reed Adler. Studio recording by Tom Fama. Location recording by Tarcisio Longobardi and Christian Cuccinello. And script support by Wenri Zhao. Special thanks to Stephen Arcieri and Matt Brody from Arcieri Talent. Our production manager was Christina DeLeggi, and the production accountant was Donna Brucale. Legal services provided by Jordan Manikin and Sam Bayard for 30 for 30 podcasts. This episode was produced by Carolyn Hepburn, Tara Nadolny, and Adiza Egan. Our line producer was Kath Sankey. Senior editorial producer for 30 for 30 podcasts was Preethi Varathan. The associate producers were Gus Navarro and Isabella Seaman. Production assistants were Diamante McKelvey and Anthony Salas. Senior producers are Marquise Daisy and Gentry Kirby. Heather Anderson, Marcia Cook, Brian Lockhart, and Burke Magnus are executive producers for 30 for 30 and ESPN Films. Rights and clearances by Jennifer Thorpe and Cal Griffith. Fact-checking by Daniel Tomorrow and Andrew Disler. This podcast was developed by Eve Troe, Adam Newhouse, and Trevor Gill.